I'm Edie Lush, and I'm the executive editor of Hub Culture. Very pleased to be here in the Hub Culture studio, where we are very proud to be partnering with Handshake. Absolutely delighted to be joined by James Slezak. How are you?
I'm really well. Yeah, it's great to be here.
Welcome to Davos.
Thank you very much. What a beautiful town.
Fantastic. So, CEO of Swayable. Now, before you tell us about Swayable, I want to hear what your thoughts are on the theme of the World Economic Forum down the road from us here, collaborating in a fragmented world. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, the world is obviously fragmented in kind of scary ways, and I think when people are collaborating, you have to ask to what end, and I think that's where leadership plays a really important role. I think obviously Davos has a lot of folks in leadership positions, and we think that if you're going to lead sets of people effectively, you have to make an effective case for where you're leading them. And so I think persuasion, which is what we tend to focus on, is a really critical component of that. If you're not persuading people of the goals, then there's no collaboration to be had.
So tell me a little bit more about that. What is the power of persuasion, and what you do? How does that help leaders measure how persuasive they are?
Yeah, well, we focus very narrowly on measuring how much impact a message has on people's opinions or their attitude or their intent to do something. And I think when you think about the role of a leader or a brand or a public figure, when they're making the case for what we should do collectively as society or as consumers or voters, they're effectively persuading you to think about the world in a way that's consistent with those goals. And so I think that the power of persuasion is really about recognizing how important it is to do that right. And you don't know if you're doing anything right unless you can measure the impact you're having. So really our contribution to that is to do that measurement as best as possible. We're known for really establishing this gold standard metric, a randomized control trial metric, for the impact on people's opinions.
How's that different from polling?
Yeah, well, we think very highly of pollsters, and pollsters are really measuring what people think right now. If I just ask you a question, do you agree or disagree? Are you going to vote? Are you not? Do you want to buy this product or not? And that's critical. What we're measuring is how you change that. And I think it's one thing to know what people think. It's another to know if you can actually impact that. And I think both go together. The polling really ultimately lets you know if you've been successful after running a big campaign, but you have to make a decision about what you're actually saying in that campaign.
Yeah.
And without the impact data, without the persuasion data, there's no way to know.
So tell me about what you've found out in recent years. What have you found about how you change people's minds, how you make people take action?
Yeah, well, there's been a big set of pendulum swings, I think, away from a couple of concepts that people thought were going to be very helpful. I think we heard a lot a few years ago about micro-targeting, getting down to the individual level to figure out how to get in your head and, manipulate you in some way, right? Creep up on your Facebook activity and, hyper-target you. And I think one thing we've learned is that that's been really overblown.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah, we don't need to creep up on your information. Right. We can ask you opt-in questions and because we're doing public communications, unless there's a lot of people that have something in common with the way you think about the world, then there is no way to craft a good message. These are billboards or TV campaigns or digital campaigns that reach thousands, millions of people. So the kind of creepy micro-targeting stuff, I think, thankfully, really isn't necessary and actually isn't effective.
Interesting. So we've swept that one away. You've worked on some interesting campaigns for brands, for people as well. So tell me about some of those.
Yeah. Well, look, we do a lot of work both with big public-facing consumer brands globally. Some of the biggest ones around, Hollywood studios, big retailers, large technology companies. We also work with a lot of public officials, political leaders in the United States. We worked very proud to work with the Biden-Harris winning presidential campaign, and also some of their primary competitors in my home country where I grew up in Australia. We actually worked with three of the sort of groupings of political candidates there. So look, it's been an incredible ride. I think seeing folks who take seriously the need to persuade and to make the case for their vision for society, and seeing how that really works when you focus on the kind of the leadership of that, the actual persuasive content of your messaging instead of kind of the poll-driven kind of blowing with the wind approach that I think has had some currency in recent decades, but I think we're starting to see people recognize that they need to make their case.
So you've worked with Paramount, for example.
Yeah, we do work with Paramount.
And you try to get people to they want to get people to come into the theaters to watch some of the big movies, right? So what have they done that's effective?
Yeah, look, Paramount's had a fantastic year. In fact, I think it's their highest grossing ever year, which is just extraordinary given that, we're not quite out of the global pandemic yet, and their whole business is based around getting people into a theatre, to pay the box office, ticket price and see these films. And they had, Top Gun Maverick was, I think, the highest grossing film. So I think they've really embraced this story that you have to make the measurements up front, that ultimately these are complicated stories and community dialogues around what to see and whether to go out to vote and what to buy in the supermarket. And so by doing really routine, rapid, systematized testing on Swayable, which they now do for all of their major releases, they really embraced that and saw that there were particular clips from these films that were really getting people getting the blood racing. Those are incredible pieces of art, and that obviously is the primary reason they were successful. We don't really take credit for their incredible year, but we were certainly part of it, and the team there's been really wonderful to work with. Yeah.
Fantastic. And you mentioned Biden-Harris as well.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about anything that surprised you, for example, during that campaign.
Yeah, look, it was an incredible campaign. I mean, there were so many surprising things, and obviously, the president was ultimately successful, which we were very, very proud to be part of. I think there were a lot of really hot debates around hot topics, especially in the primary elections, and it was very interesting to see how I think there were quite big differences in telling the same story in different ways. That if you told, for example, stories about healthcare policy using particular anecdotes and particular kind of complaints that people have about affordability and accessibility, the same policy can be more influential in terms of the persuasive impact of the story told one way than another way. There can often be very dramatic differences.
Interesting. So, is there anything in particular that you noticed about that, like one story versus another one?
There were a lot of these town hall debates, and I think in the debates often or meetings, people would come up and tell their own stories, and you'd often see folks who'd have real issues with the healthcare system. You had a woman who struggled to afford care for her kid, and then you'd have another person on the side that had almost a very similar story. And I remember noticing, at least in one of these cases, that the fundamental story was basically the same policy, but vastly more persuasive impact with a particular story about a child, than just some other particular story. And there were kind of subtle nuances, I think, in how compelling the particular kind of interlocutor was in those debates, and stuff that you just wouldn't pick up in advance and you wouldn't know without getting the data.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I wonder what strong policy ideas, how they come across in an election. Strong policy ideas are often very divisive. Things like abortion, things like gun control.
Right.
And I imagine, or I hypothesize, that sometimes we might want to see policy leaders shy away from those. But what does your data and research tell you?
Yeah, we've been really excited. We've done a really large meta study where we looked at basically every ad that was tested on Swayable in the political context through the last 2 or 3 cycles. And there are people who'll say, look, you're trying to reach people in the middle. Don't talk about things that are too divisive. They might not agree. Talk about mum and pop, kitchen table, apple pie, sort of chicken in every pot kind of stories. And look, it's not to say that those don't work sometimes, but we wanted to look really carefully and see, okay, let's look at these so-called divisive issues. Let's look at women's reproductive rights. These are fundamental rights. Let's look at the treatment of black Americans by, police. These are issues that matter, and I think, political leadership and public leadership in general is sort of, having the guts to kind of take on an issue that matters. But there are these voices that will say sometimes, well, save it till later. Just talk about the uncontroversial stuff now, and let's get to that afterwards. And we were able to see really decisively that you could win and persuade moderate voters as effectively with many of these focuses on these stories about so-called divisive issues than the stuff that is sort of uncontroversial. And I think if only people had known that earlier, I think maybe we might have talked a little more about abortion rights, for example, in the United States, and perhaps we might have kept that dialogue going in order to kind of preserve some of the rights that I think have, regrettably to many people, millions of people, have been lost.
Interesting. So, given that study, what would you recommend in terms of a communication tip for leaders or for brands who are looking to make change?
Yeah, I think using the data intelligently, running real experiments of the kind that we do, but there's different ways to do it, and not being kind of poll-driven, not sort of thinking that simply surveying people in the absence of your story is enough. You know, you can ask people what they think, but you're there to tell a story. So the question is not necessarily just what they think, but it's how they're going to react to what you've got to say. And if you think, you know, reproductive rights are important, if you think that going to see Top Gun Maverick is important, if you think, you know, buying, you know, Thomas's English muffins is important. And,
I love Thomas's English muffins.
Yeah, excellent.
That's not, I'm not.
Thank you, I endorse them. I'm you know, a little more compromised since they're a cherished customer.
Right.
But you know, then you've got to look at how that story moves people. You can't just look at what they think without the story.
Interesting. Thank you very much, James, for stopping inside the Hub Culture Handshake Studio.
Great to be here.
Davos 2023.